Ah, Edward! How fares the raft of the Medusa?
Welcome to the story of the raft of the Medusa. Are you ready to hear about the trials and tribulations of naval Europeans of the 19th century? If not, I'd sit this and a lot of my other videos out. It's 1816, the Napoleonic Wars have finally come to an end, and the French ship Medusa is packed to the gills with men, women and children. It's sailing for the French colony of Senegal. Among those present is a new governor, a man named Schmaltz. That name will get funnier the more you find out what happened. During the war, the colony had been conquered by the British, and now with Louis XVIII placed on the throne, they're ready to hand it back to the new French allies. Also present is a rich family of merchants, the Picards. Several hundred soldiers, a full crew, support staff for the soldiers, and many, many more. The captain was a man named Chaumaret, a viscount who received the job because he was in with the king, and hadn't sailed for about 20 years. The Medusa was the fastest ship in its convoy and sped ahead, losing contact with its fellow ships, the Echo and the Argus. The captain then decided to involve one of its passengers with navigation, a passenger with no experience or qualification in guiding ships. But he was a philosopher, so at least he probably realised this was a dumb idea. The captain then mistook a cloud bank for Cape Blanco, an important marker on the journey, and made a wrong turn. They sailed straight into an area of increasingly shallow water, mud and sandbars. They were 100 miles off course and sailing straight into the area the markers were there to help them avoid. Before long, they crashed into a sandbar. They were about 50 miles from the coast. The captain's first plan was very simple: remove as much of the wood as possible to create a giant raft, which could then be used to carry the heaviest belongings from the ship, so they might be able to move the ship off the sandbar and get it afloat again. This attempt failed, partially because the captain refused to move some of the ship's heaviest items, the cannons, in case sharks attacked them, I guess. So they had another plan: abandon the ship and use the ship's boats to ferry everyone to the coast of Africa over multiple trips, and set up a camp to defend themselves against, and I quote, Arab slavers, while one of the boats heads to the colony to get help. The problem was that a gale developed, the ship was breached and flooded. Those in charge panicked and the multiple trips part of the idea was abandoned. The vast majority of the officers and rich civilians, the governor et al., were put into some comfortably non-full boats, while most of the poor bastards were piled onto the raft. Eventually, there were so many people on the raft that they were so cramped that they were standing shoulder to shoulder, and the weight was so great that the water was up to their waists. Around this time, soldiers refused to continue getting on board. Looking like they would be abandoned on the ship, those soldiers aimed their guns at the governor and captain's boats. So the last longboat, already full of sailors, soldiers and others, was sent to collect the rest of the men. They piled on. When the boat left, it had 90 people on board. So crammed was it that it was in serious danger of sinking, and there were still 17 men left in the Medusa. Mostly blind drunk, because they decided they'd rather go out happy and raided the stores. So the boats left, the officers' boats tied to the raft in a convoy. But the raft was a gigantic, lumbering, monstrous lattice made of wood without a rudder, a massive wooden anchor, and was almost impossible to pull. So several miles from the ship, the governor gave the order to let the raft loose. The overladen boat assumed the rope broke and went to help reset the convoy, but quickly realised that the other boats were moving away fast. They were in no shape to pull the raft themselves and couldn't handle any more passengers, so they left too. There were almost 150 people on the raft. The highest ranked officer was a midshipman called Coudain. He had an open leg wound, and like I said, the water was up to their waists. Another notable person on board was Crozier, who'd made the choice to board instead of go in one of the boats because his men were assigned there and he decided to share their fate. So there they were, 150 people alone in the African sun. Almost no provisions. Some wine in the summer sun above. With no ability to sit down, let alone lie down and sleep. No cover, no shelter, and no hope. 2 weeks later, the Argus accidentally came across the raft. The men, previously having darkly joked that the Argus would find them because it was named after the many-eyed monster from Greek mythology. 15 people were left alive, and many of them would die in the coming days. So, what happened? Well, on the first night, about 20 people died through suicide, by falling off the raft or by being pushed. In the days that followed, they drank the wine as heavily as they could. Only the centre of the raft was truly safe as powerful waves battered them, so men fought to get to the centre, which was mainly occupied by the highest ranked. A horrible group madness took hold, and after a couple of nights there were pitched battles on board, with people slashing with whatever weapons they could find into the throng of humanity. Sleep-deprived, drunk, exhausted and suffering exposure, Within days, almost everyone was hallucinating. By day 4, there were about 70 people left alive and the cannibalism began. But not because of hunger, because of thirst. A few days after that, the healthiest on board decided to make what meagre supplies remained stretch by throwing the wounded and sickest overboard. When the Argus found them, only 15 remained alive. When the survivors, who didn't die right after the rescue, made it to the colony, they had a welcome from the new Governor Schmaltz, who was extremely interested in having them sign affidavits that stated the rope snapped by accident and they were not cast away. Most of those who signed were delirious, dying, and or terrified of getting on the wrong side of a man who was in with the king. Now, none of the other boats had a pleasant trip to safety, but very few died. Those in the overloaded boat had it worst. Even though the area was filled with, and I quote, Arab slavers, the majority of them demanded to be left off on the coast and decided to walk to safety. They were in such danger of sinking in their cramped little boat that they decided they'd rather walk a couple of 100 miles on the edge of a desert in an area crawling with, and I quote, Arab slavers. And on the way, they did eventually meet some locals, and they were quickly escorted to the colony. They had a long-standing deal with the colony to rescue any stranded Europeans in exchange for a bounty. I don't know if the locals were actually slavers, but if they were, that's very clever. 2 of the survivors of the raft went back to France and wrote their stories. They were printed in anti-monarchist papers, and shit hit the fan. As you'd expect, the governor did all he could to destroy their reputations, bringing out the affidavits that he'd had survivors, delirious from heatstroke and other things, sign in an effort to discredit their version of events. Some of the men who'd signed them would later rescind them, claiming they weren't in their right minds when they signed, which, to be fair, they weren't. But in the end, the only person who would face charges for what happened was the captain, de Chaumaret. He was court-martialed for incompetence and for leaving men behind on the ship, among other things. He faced the death penalty, but only got 3 years in prison, probably because of the same connections that got him the job. Now, about the ship. After the survivors made it to the colony, the governor decided he wanted to try and reclaim the Medusa's cargo, gold. And when the wreck was located, it was discovered that 3 of the 17 men left were still alive. It was 54 days later. The ship was lodged into the sandbar, so it was never in any real danger of sinking. But you wouldn't know that from the conditions on board. It was waterlogged, battered by heavy seas, almost entirely flooded. Parts had been torn to pieces by the waves. Much of the stores were lost or unusable, with some going overboard in the initial attempt to turn the raft into a floating storehouse. Governor Schmaltz was recalled from his post in 1818, and in the wake of the disaster, French law was changed to try and ensure that promotions would be made on merit, not nepotism. Obviously, that law doesn't always work as intended, but it's better than nothing. This painting, Theodore Geralt's masterpiece, The Raft of the Medusa, depicts the moment those in the raft spot the Argus. The Argus didn't spot them back, though. It's just pure luck that a few hours later, as the survivors lay sleeping, the Argus returned and found them. The painting caused a stir when it was unveiled. The events were used to attack the monarchy, and as ever, French politics were fiery. It initially had to be exhibited under the title Shipwreck Scene, because it officially had nothing to do with the Medusa. 3 survivors worked with Geralt as he painted it. One of them was a carpenter, and he created a scale replica of the raft for him to work from. He painted alternate versions before settling on the moment of rescue, including this one that depicted the cannibalism, and spent weeks visiting morgues so he could depict the dead as accurately as possible. The Raft of the Medusa was probably the most famous naval disaster of the early 19th century. In the 80s, a film was made about it, but I've not been able to find a copy. I did, however, find this wonderful documentary about the events in the painting, so please check it out if you want to know more. You might wonder why the British were so reticent to believe that the crews of the Franklin expedition could be driven to cannibalism, given what happened to the Medusa. Well, I'd assume that they took exactly the wrong moral from the events and assumed it wasn't anything to do with human frailty or desperation or terrible conditions, but because they were French. Next up, I'm back to the Terror, and we'll see how bad it gets for the Arctic raft.